So welcome back to Drug School. Today on Drug School, we have another one of our technicians who is working outside the box. Today it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jacob Boor. And Jacob is working in an oncology clinic in the east side of Michigan. And um, we're going to learn a little bit about his career path. His career path is not terribly uncommon to most of us. He started out in retail pharmacy, as most of us generally do, and he transitioned to a hospital pharmacy, and now he's working in oncology clinics. Now, there's a couple of interesting things that he does that you don't typically see. Number one, he does not work on a daily basis around a pharmacist. He does not have a pharmacist present in his daily practice. In Michigan, that's perfectly fine. Pharmacy technicians do not have to work under pharmacists. We can work under doctors or even veterinarians. So in Michigan, we can under our licenses work in non-standard places where a pharmacist wouldn't typically be located. And I certainly think that there's a case for pharmacy technicians to be in doctors' offices and doing some of the clinic work, doing prior authorizations on drugs, doing med reviews with patients, and not necessarily doing the consulting, but verifying what their regimen actually is with each patient. So um, Jacob does the reconstitution of medications while he also does a little bit of advocating for his patients, trying to get his medications covered under their health plan or finding ways for them to nourish their bodies as they go through chemotherapy. Um, so he does a lot of things where you wouldn't standardly see a pharmacy technician go. And some of what you're going to learn when you do this is what life is like to work independent of a pharmacist. And also, you're going to get a little bit of a takeaway at sometimes you just have to write your own job description. And he also talks a little bit about what it's like to actually learn something new and be able to cross the disciplinary paths with a doctor and how it helped him solve one of his patient's problems with his treatment. So, Jacob has a lot to offer. I hope you enjoy this episode of Drug School. If you are a technician in an out of the box role, I would appreciate hearing from you. Leave me a note in the comments and I will certainly get in touch. Um, if you like to see me make other content, like and subscribe to the channel. I always welcome new subscribers to my channel and uh, try to grow this community, and we all can learn from each other. So, welcome to Drug School, and I hope you enjoy. All right. So, why don't you go a little bit through your background, and then we'll so how you got involved in the career and whatnot, and then we'll kind of see where the conversation goes from here.
Sure. So let's see. When I graduated from high school, roughly 2001, um, the local CVS, they had posted for a job for a pharmacy service associate, which is basically a fancy way of saying, not really a technician, but not really a cashier. And so I figured, what the heck, and so I was like, it's a pretty cool job, but, it wasn't really in my career path. It wasn't something that I was like super interested in doing. I had other plans that, whatever, just didn't work out. But anyway, so fast forward, but a little more than 10 years, well, almost 15 years. So I was working at a music store, like selling, instruments and instrument accessories and all that kind of stuff. And they had basically let me know that they were no longer able to keep me employed, um, budget constraints and all of that. And so I said, well, this is my chance to kind of pick what I want to do as opposed to just whatever's available. And I said, I really liked working in the pharmacy, so I'll give it a shot. So I applied at like every pharmacy known to man, all in the area where I lived. And I got a call from Walgreens, and they said, yeah, we could use somebody. Come on down and interview. And I did. And they let me know, yeah, welcome aboard. So it was what, 2014, right? Yeah, 2014. Started at Walgreens. So that's kind of how I got into pharmacy in the first.
All right, and I find it rather interesting. You and I started at CVS. That's where I got my career start too. That was 2009. I started at CVS. So you're working in as I understand it, an oncology clinic.
Correct.
Oh, okay. And how did you find out about that?
Well, so I left Walgreens after several of my coworkers left to kind of say, well, there's other opportunities out there that pay way better than retail. And I said, I can get down on that.
Very true.
So, right. So I had kind of done a couple of different things. I worked for an insurance company for very briefly as a contract employee. Um, and so it's like, well, I'm digging not working retail. So I kind of did a couple of different things, and I wound up at Children's Hospital here in Detroit. Um, and I worked there for a little over a year, and I just kind of figured that was going to be my thing. And about a year prior, I'd used like everyone calls it a headhunting service, kind of like it's called MedMatch. And basically what they do is employers will find employees for people. It's kind of like a contract, like they pay so much for these people to find employees for them. And so I'd used this service about a year prior. So this would have been 2016.
Okay.
And at the time, it didn't pan out. And then in 2017, they called me and they said, well, hey, I don't know what you're doing right now, but, we have a position in Sterling Heights, which is literally down the street from where I live, as opposed to Detroit, which is about a 45-minute commute. And they said, are you familiar with mixing chemotherapy? I said, actually, I am. Working in a hospital, that's part of what we did. And so they said, well, if you want more information, just let me know. I said, well, more information could never hurt anybody. So I went in and talked to these people, and they asked me all the usual questions. Like, it was basically like an interview that, the actual employer didn't have to do. And then they asked me, like, how much do you want to make and all this jazz. And so we went through all of that. And then that's kind of how I landed in the oncology field. Was they had a need for a pharmacy tech, someone to come and mix the drugs for them, because the nurses were spending so much time mixing the drugs for their patients, they weren't able to do much patient care. So they said, well, you're just going to kind of mix the drugs and then do whatever anybody tells you to do. And so then slowly but surely, I kind of started taking over a lot of the different aspects of it, like anything that came in through shipment, restocking anything that needed to be restocked. The only basically thing I didn't do was order the drug and the supply itself.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how I wound up in oncology. And then several weeks ago, my boss at the time had said, hey, do you know any farm techs that are looking for work? And I said, well, in terms of what? And I said, is it like what we do here? And she said, yeah. And I said, not really. I said, because I don't really keep in contact with the people from the hospital. And I said, the people that I do keep in contact with, I said, they don't have that kind of experience. I said, they really wouldn't have a good fit. And so she said, well, maybe this would work out well for you. She says, because, I know you like it here and we like you, but She says, you're paying a lot for insurance, which is true. I was paying an insane amount of insurance for my family.
Okay.
And she says, I mean, if you could pay less for insurance, it'd be a good move for you. And long story short, I went to a different company. And so now I work for a company called Verdi Oncology.
Okay.
They're based out of Tennessee.
Okay. And going back to when you were in the clinic in Sterling Heights, did you work under a pharmacist or were you working under a doctor?
Under the doctors.
Okay. Because one of the things that I find interesting in Michigan's laws is in Michigan, pharmacy technicians don't have to work under a pharmacist.
Right.
We can work under doctors, and some of the ongoing conversation is um, getting pharmacy professionals in doctors' offices. And so, what was it like working in a pharmacy role without having a pharmacist around?
It was very different because coming from the hospital, doing chemotherapy, we needed 3 checks before it went out to the floor. You kind of had to set everything up and kind of lay out your process and say, well, this is what I'm doing here. Here's all the the different equipment that I need. Here's the drug. If it's we'll say it's 65 mils, you pull out 65 mils and however many syringes it takes, and you kind of say, here's everything laid out for you. And we had these sheets that we had to fill out, and a pharmacist had to come and check everything. And that was a separate pharmacist from the IV room pharmacist. And so the IV room pharmacist had to come in and check everything. And then your IV room pharmacist had to come in and give it a final check because we primed the line with the chemotherapy using a pump. And so they had to come in and make sure that there were no bubbles and all that other kind of jazz, because apparently the nurses priming their own lines in that situation can be, I don't know. I talked to one of my coworkers about it, and she came from inpatient, and she said, well, it's simply because it's very easy for us to get distracted. And if something doesn't go right, you can spike the bag, and then you have so you can puncture the bag, and things can go wrong. So it is a lot easier to have you guys prime it for us. Nobody ever explained that to us when we were at the hospital, so we were a little resentful.
Right.
But but it's very different because it's just kind of like now it's just a very simple check. Everyone kind of trusts that you know what you're doing, and I mean they just make sure that you did your math right and you pulled out the right amount of drug, and then away you go. It's not nearly as I don't want to say serious, but there's not as much, I guess, put onto the pharmacist. There's more put on you. Make sure that you're doing things right. Um, it's a totally different world. It's a little bit more relaxed.
I've noticed that too. Now that I in the role I have now, I've worked without actually having a pharmacist present in my daily life for 4 months now, and it is certainly a more relaxed environment when you don't have a stressed out pharmacist next to you all the time,
Yeah.
right? Um, so what does your daily life involve now?
Well, that's interesting because being with this new company, I've only been there 2 weeks now. Um, it's interesting because we're starting from the ground up. Like they started this practice because they want to grow and build these kind of clinics, where people can come into their doctor's office, see the staff that they know, and get their treatments right there in their doctor's office. And then they can just walk out the door and go home, as opposed to doing like an inpatient facility or like where I came from, the office previously, we had a larger office across the hall. It was considered to be inpatient, like on paper, but it was a very large clinic. And so you never really necessarily saw the same nurse twice. So we
Right.
want to provide a situation where you're seeing the same nurse every time. You're building a relationship with a person. So all of that is it makes it so different, and I think it's great. Um, so with that being said, um, we don't have a whole lot of patients right now. We're building very slowly to kind of gain more, but where I came from, it was very. We had 10 chairs in the office I came from previously, and and we there were days where we were very busy, where I would sit there, I would mix for easily 4 to 6 hours without much of a break,
Wow.
and it can be rather intense. But no, it's kind of we're looking at how what's the next step, because with not having many patients, it's more an insurance thing. It's who are we, allowed to work with insurance. Currently, we're restricted to certain forms of Blue Cross, Medicare. We can't even see Medicaid patients currently. We're working on expanding. It's all legal stuff, and so I'm just kind of trying to fill in where is needed. Like, hey, do you need help figuring out why this was denied for treatment? Or I think this week I worked a lot on getting free samples of like Ensure and Boost and things like that. They're helpful for the patients, because a lot of chemotherapy patients, they don't feel like eating. And
Right.
that's not a good thing. So we try to get them things, and it's easier to drink when you don't feel like eating. So get some protein and calories and things like that. But it's like that was a lot of my job this week was, can you get us free samples so we can hand them out to our patients?
Wow. And so you do a little bit of almost being a patient advocate and also a pharmacy technician at the same time to some degree.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And if you had some advice for what someone wanting to get into this field would be, what would you tell them?
Well, my advice to anybody, any kind of pharmacy technician, would be there's more to life than retail. And people say that a lot, but I mean there are so many options other than retail. It's not just hospital, it's not just insurance. There's long-term care, there's things like what I do. But to get into what I do, you really need to have some kind of experience in mixing, like doing IV drugs. So there are those certification programs to get like IV certified and whatnot. I'm not sure if that would help. I never did any of that, and I seem to be doing just fine. But that's just because I happen to be lucky enough to have the right experience. Now, I can't say if someone were to go out and become IV certified that would land them a job with something like this, but it may not hurt. You get trained to do things the way that they want you to do it. So I wouldn't say give up if you've never had any experience. So it's just you got to try. And I guess that's my bottom line: is you got to try something.
True. Very true. And so if you went more of someone getting in your role, you're working fairly independently now. Um, so someone getting into your type of a role, you probably would want to go through hospital pharmacy first.
I would think so. I think it's a huge help. I started in pediatrics. Pediatrics is one of the hardest ways to get into a hospital, because everything is so specific. With adults, it's a lot easier to say, well, everybody gets, such and such a dose of this drug. Everybody gets
Right.
8 milligrams of Zofran. Well, with a kid, you can't give every single kid the same thing. So it was very intense. And there were a lot of times where I was like, we worked as a part of a larger network of hospitals, the Detroit Medical Center. I was like, maybe I'll just go over to the hospital across the lawn here, because I'm not sure if I can hack it in pediatrics anymore. It's hard. It's very intense, because every single dose is different, and you get these batches that are 200, 300 labels, you know twice a shift, and you have a partner that helps you out, but it's like everything is so specific, and even 1 milligram one way or the other can be disastrous, you know.
Right.
So it's very intense. Um, so yeah.
Interesting going the pediatric route. I did compounding was my previous job from here. Um, so I did compounding pharmacy for 10 years. And we, on my side of the state, you and I both work in the same state. My side of the state, um, we work with Spectrum Health
Hmm.
primarily, and I did a lot of pediatric compounding, which was basically taking adult doses of heart drugs and not necessarily cancer drugs, but we would do a lot with the heart center, taking those mega doses of drugs and reducing them down to um, pediatric dosing. So you got really
Yeah.
good at doing that, and you do that a lot in the veterinary world too. Um, I did veterinary compounding was my specialty, and everything is weight based. So
Sure.
I can't. The one thing you learn in veterinary pharmacy is 100 milligrams of Valium will not kill a dog. Um, so I think that was the first stroke I had in pharmacy. Was a veterinarian calling in going, yeah, I need diazepam. I need 100 milligram suppository. Beg your pardon? A what?
Yeah. That's I think I would have the same reaction, honestly. You know, and it's like that's one of the things that was like going from pediatrics to adults was like rounding doses. I was like, dude, we never rounded doses in the hospital. And they're like, well, you work with pediatrics. I was like, that's true. You always have to keep that in mind. It's like, okay, well, we use rather than actual body weight, we use ideal body weight, you know, for certain, you know, certain regimens, you know, so a lot of it's based on your body surface area. And people are like, what do you mean area? I was like, well, I don't know. I'm not the doctor, but that's what we do. It's based on your, you know, your how many, it's milligrams per meter squared. So like leucovorin would be used, some like at the office that I came from, we use 200 milligrams per meter squared. And this new office, they say, well, we use 400 milligrams per meter squared. And it's like you can consult all kinds of different sources and it'll tell you different things. And they're like, okay, well, this, if we use their ideal body weight, it comes up to this. But if we use their actual body weight, this dose is absolutely huge. And that's just crazy. Why would we do that? So it's different. It's every little field has its own little intricacies, and it's always very interesting.
Sorry, my dog has decided he wants to be a YouTube star.
That's okay.
um, so, and you're yeah, it's interesting that you get into body surface area. So I've never had to do that in a calculation ever. Explain that calculation, how you always got to that.
You know, I do, it's all figured out for me, to be honest with you. And there's a formula. There's like the nurses that I worked with previously. They had they had websites and bookmarks and everything on the computers that they opened up to do everything, which it's great. It's a great resource. So they would plug in the height and the weight, and there's a specific formula that they had to use. And then it came out to this is their BSA, this is their, 2.02 meters squared or whatever. And so, like, if your drug is 100 milligrams per meter squared, you times that by 2.02, and there's your dose.
Nice.
Sometimes it's 800, sometimes it's, it just depends on what you were trying to accomplish. And every, package insert is absolutely different from the next. And it's funny because, to kind of swerve into a different lane here, my wife follows a lot of a lot of sick kids on Facebook. Just kind of something she stumbled across, and she's she's a good advocate for these people, and she kind of tries to be a sounding board for parents because it's these kids and it's devastating. And so people, she'll say, and I'm just curious based on what I do. I'm like, parents will say, oh, well, they had this huge chemo regimen and they did this and this and this. And I'm like, well, I wonder if it was this, this, and this. She's like, oh, I'll ask them. And this happened the other night. And she said, she asked his parents, she said, well, what, regimen was, your child on for 5 days straight and this and that. And she says, well, I'll have to look it up, but I think it was this. And I said, that's basically what I had figured. And then somebody else saw it and said, well, what if they use this drug and would that work? And I'm kind of like doing my like 10-minute like research, like with Dr. Google here. And I'm like, well, from everything, I'm like, disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a pharmacist. I went to literally 16 hours of school to learn this, and it's
Right.
like, I understand a lot of things, but at the same time, there's a whole lot that I don't understand. So don't take this to the grave, please. But I would say, here's my answer. Like, no, I don't think this would work because I don't think it's for the same indications, and this and that. And I go, okay, well that helps a lot. And I'm like, well, I'm glad I could help. It's interesting to kind of get involved in this whole scenario to really people come to you with the weirdest things, and sometimes it's great that they trust you, and sometimes it's like I wouldn't maybe put so much faith in me.
Right. Um, and I've in my practice now, I see a lot of oncology. Um, I find myself having to look up drugs all the time now. There's drugs I've never even heard of that come across my desk nowadays. How and a lot of them are the new biologic oncology drugs. How has that changed? I know you're still fairly relatively new to this, but how has that changed what you might be seeing in cancer clinics?
Well, it's interesting because in the short amount of time that I've been doing this, there's some things. A great example is Opdivo. Opdivo is a drug that I don't know how long it's been out there, but it's a biologic. It's one of those things where we give it in a bag of saline and it's run for 35 minutes or 30 minutes and then they go home. There's no pre-meds, they don't need to take steroids or anything like that with it. It's just this, and it's generally given every 2 weeks. Well, we had a guy at the clinic that I came from. Um, he says, well, I don't want to come in here every 2 weeks. So the doctor said, well, I'm okay with pushing it to every 3 weeks, but every 4 weeks would be a little bit much for me. And so I just happened to have an offhand conversation with a drug rep one day as they came in and we were chatting, like, oh, what do you do? I said, oh, I'm a pharmacy tech. And they said, oh, so you must know all about this. I'm like, well, not really. I'm not a pharmacist. And so sometimes they talk to me like I knew everything. And I'm just kind of like, I don't really know how to break up this conversation. So we'll just keep going and be like, oh, okay, that's really interesting. I have no clue what they're saying. But they had said that there had been a recent change in how the drug was administered. You could double the dose to make it, instead of 240 milligrams every 2 weeks, it could be 480 milligrams every 4 weeks. Mentioned this to one of the nurses that took care of this patient who said, I don't want to come in every 2 weeks. And I said, you might want to mention this to his doctor and just say, and she's like, well, why does nobody tell us this? I said, well, I just have to be in the right place at the right time. But it's things like that. They're kind of figuring out how things work and how things can change for to let these people have lives outside of just coming in for treatment. Because a lot of time they come in and they feel like garbage until basically like 2 days before their next treatment. And it's just sad, but they are figuring out different ways, and there's all kinds of new different drugs that are coming out, all different kinds of biologics and whatnot that are coming out, and it's super interesting for someone like me who, I mean, I like to learn about this kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
So,
And I've been doing a lot of the same thing. I came across two drugs a couple weeks ago, I'm going to screw it up, Telfinar and Mechanist, I think is the other one. Um, if I didn't have them sitting right in front of me, I wouldn't be able to tell you what they are or what they do. Um, but all I remember about them was is they were they were 20. I think the combined cost of the drugs was $21,000.
That
And
sounds about right. Yeah, there's a new drug, newer, I guess. I don't know. We used it a couple of times at my previous clinic. We're using it for a patient, but it was more given more and more and more. It's called Yervoy, and it's usually given in conjunction with Opdivo. And usually people get a flat dose of Opdivo. It's 240 milligrams every 2 weeks, kind of like I said before. But with this particular thing, when they give it with Yervoy, they base it on weight. And so that's for so many, like I think it's like 4 treatments that they give them together, and then they drop the Yervoy, and then they go back to the flat dose of Opdivo. And that drug is ridiculously expensive. I mean, like when it comes from our supplier, it comes wrapped in, but like the box comes wrapped in 2 layers of bubble wrap. Like if that tells you anything, like the expensive drugs, they come wrapped in bubble wrap, but this one is like double wrapped, and it's like that's crazy to me. That's I just think it's funny to see that kind of thing. You know, it's like they want to make sure that it's not their fault if that stuff breaks.
right, no kidding. Um, yeah, it's like I don't want to be on the hook for 80 some odd $1,000.
Exactly.
Um, but yeah, it's certainly changed the landscape, not just in cost, but also how we do things. And I just had another question that I had thought of, and it fell right out of my head. Um, but so it sounds like an interesting field. I'm more of a regulatory, brainy, um, but type guy. So I usually learn all about the drugs and then try to figure out how to make them less expensive. That's
We need people like you. Don't worry.
um,
I mean, I'm type 1 diabetic, so I mean, I can tell you insulin is insanely expensive and there's no need for it. But I think that's another interview for another time.
no lie. I think that we could spend all week trying to delve in the cost of drugs. Although they're now deciding that there's non-insulin treatments for type 1 diabetes. I was reading a study about that the other day.
Hmm.
Um, they're going to go to, I think it's one of the SLGT inhibitors is going
Hmm.
to get approved for type 1. So um,
Interesting.
so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Um,
Yeah, of
but Jacob, I do appreciate you doing this for us.
course.
Um, and it's been an absolute pleasure. All right, so there you have it. Again, I'd like to thank Jacob for spending some time with us today, especially on a day off on a very cold Michigan day to join us. And it's been a pleasure to have you join us. Again, if you like the content of Drug School, we always appreciate having you join us. So like and subscribe to the channel, and you'll get updates when new videos are created. Patreon.com/drug school is a way to support what we do. Again, thank you for joining us for Drug School, and we'll talk to you again next time.